Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into attributed string in SwiftUI. You'll learn how to create a fully functional rich text editor from scratch, complete with a custom keyboard toolbar with bold, italics, underline, strikethrough, color, font, and alignment options, all using the latest iOS 26 APIs. Attributed or attributed strings are character strings that have attributes for individual characters or ranges of characters such as font, color, and style like bold or italics, along with paragraph attributes like alignment. With iOS 26, this has become much easier to work with in text fields and text editors, and it gives us the ability to add rich text to our own app very easily. In this series, I'll begin by showing you how to implement this and to create your own set of keyboard toolbar buttons, much like you see in Apple's Notes app, so you can begin to add rich text views to your own app. We'll begin by creating a basic set of buttons for the most common rich text options like bold, italic, underline, and strikethrough, and ensure that the toolbar buttons indicate the current state. Then we'll add a more extensive set of buttons that will allow you to change the size, text alignment, and color of the selected text. In subsequent videos, I'll show you how to build a full app and be able to persist the attributed strings to the Swift data store. I do have a starter project for this video, and I encourage you to download it from the link in the description. There are multiple branches, and if you want to work along with me, make sure you download the starter project branch. You can either clone the repository or download the zipped archive. I do recommend that you work along with me, but if you'd prefer, you can also download the completed source code for this video, and that's the rich text editor branch. It's up to you. Now, the starter code is really just a content view that we'll begin to change shortly. I've also added a folder called helpers, though, that contains files that we'll be using throughout this series, so it's important that you use the starter project if you want to follow along. The selection style helper will be used later in this video, while the color extension is going to be used in the next one. Now, the first thing I want to do is rename content view, and I'm going to rename it to rich text editor view. Now I want to embed the current text view within a navigation stack. And I'll assign a navigation title, and I'll use the string rich text editor. Now it uses the default title display mode, the large title. But if I use a toolbar title display mode, it also gives me access to an inline, not only small, but large. So do you notice the difference between the toolbar title display mode and the standard large title on a navigation title display mode? I like this. Next, I want to replace the text view with a text editor view. And up until iOS 26, you'd have to bind the text editor to a string. But now we can bind it to an attributed string. So we'll need to create a new state variable that I'll call text, and I'll define it as an attributed string with an initial value of an empty string. So now we can replace that text field with the text editor bound to that state variable. Now I'm going to add some padding to the text editor. And we only want to be able to scroll vertically if necessary. And since a text editor is actually a scroll view too, we can use a scroll bounce behavior based on size. So it will only scroll if it needs to. Well, in the preview canvas, now you can add some text to your text editor. And nothing is different here from a binding to a string. But here's the difference. If you select a word or a range of text, you can then see an arrow beyond the replace, in my case, to see more options. And one of these is the BIU format option that you can expand. Here you can see bold, italic, and underline. So you can choose one of these, like bold, and your selected text will be formatted accordingly. Let's make this word italics. Now, if you take that bold string again and do this again, you'll see a check mark on bold. So I could choose to add another style, but I also see a More option. And this presents another format menu pop-up from the bottom that gives you more options with bold selected, but you have other options like color or font or size, along with text alignment options. And this time you can choose any number of these and apply them all at once to your selected text. Now this is great, but how many of your users would actually know how to do this? So what I want to do for the rest of this video is to create a toolbar that we can eventually add to the keyboard that will somewhat mimic this functionality of that menu and more. The first thing we're going to do is to create buttons that will allow us to set the style to either bold, italic, underline, and I'm also going to add a strikethrough button. So this is going to require another state variable that's going to hold our selected text. So we can create that state variable and call it selection and assign to it an instance of the attributed text selection class. Next, I can add a new argument now to my text editor called selection, which we can bind to this new state variable. Now I want to attach to the text editor a toolbar. Inside the toolbar, I'm going to add a toolbar item group with a placement argument. And we have a number of options to choose from. Now, eventually we're going to use the keyboard placement, but for now, we can continue work in the preview canvas by using bottom bar. And it's this toolbar that I want to add 4 buttons, one for each of the bold, italic, underline, and strike through buttons. So I'll create 4 buttons with those labels. And we're going to use system labels. And it turns out that SF Symbols has symbols whose names are the same as the styles that we want to try to apply. So bold, italic, underline, and strike through. Those are the titles for our 4 buttons. Now notice how the buttons are all nicely grouped together in the bottom toolbar? That's nice. No need to worry about any additional styling. Well, now we have to create actions that will perform the style changes when the buttons are tapped. And this requires a new environment variable for the key path that's called font resolution context. So I'm going to assign that to a variable of the same name. So first for the bold action. What we can do is we can apply a transformAttributes method to the text state variable. And this gives us the ability to apply this to the attributed text selection. And this is an in-out parameter, which means that it will get applied in place. Pressing Enter on the body closure lets us define a variable for that in-out attributes container. So we'll call it container, and we can use that then in our code. So if the selected text is not yet bold, we want to make it bold. And if it's already bold, we want to unbold it. So first we'll need to get the current font that is applied to the container, which is optional. And if one has not been applied, then we can simply just assign the default font. Next, we can evaluate this font to a resolved font given the current context. And this will let us determine if bold has been assigned. Now the resolve method on the current font takes an argument that is our environment variable's font resolution context. So we can check to see if that has been resolved to bold. If it has, then we'll apply the container.font, the result of applying the bold method on our temporary current font while passing in false. Otherwise, we can pass in true. So you can test this out in the preview now and see that if you enter some text and select it, you can toggle that bold attribute on or off. Now this can all be shortened to a single line where the container font is equal to the current font.bold based on whether or not resolved is bold. What does not work right now is displaying any indication on the button that it has been applied, and we're going to handle this later. In the meantime, we can do the same thing for italics. Notice the other options that we have for monospace, small caps, etc. You'll not find underline or strike through here though. We'll have to handle this differently. So for underline, we'll still need the transformAttributes method though. And we'll need that for both. Well, this time it's actually even easier. We'll need to check first to see if the container's underline style is already been applied as single. If it has, we'll change it to none. Otherwise, that means it was none, and we'll change it to single. Strike through works exactly the same way. Let's test this in the preview. I can enter some text, and I can select it. And then I can set each of the 4 different attributes one at a time and their compounded applications. And then tapping once more will remove them one at a time. So what I want to do is to add 2 more buttons. One that's going to allow us to present the extended formatting menu, and the other one that's going to dismiss the keyboard if it's presented. So I'll need 2 more state properties. I'm going to create a Boolean state property called more editing and set it to false. And this is going to be used to present that new formatting menu. And the second one is going to be a focus state variable. And I'm going to make that a Boolean named isFocused. And then the focus state can now be applied to our text editor. So in the Toolbar Items group, I want to separate these buttons with the 2 new ones. So I'm going to add a spacer. And then for the first, I'll create a button with the system name Text Format Alt. And the action is simply going to be to toggle more editing. And then I'm going to create another button where the label is going to be a system image of keyboard chevron.compact.down. And the action is going to be to set isFocused to false, and thus dismiss the keyboard if it's present. So now the text editor doesn't have a focus, so none of these buttons make any sense. So we should probably disable that in this case. So I'm going to need to select all of the buttons in the toolbar and group them. And then I can attach to the group a disable modifier, and that value is going to depend on whether or not isFocused is or is not. So now you can see that until we tap into the text editor, the buttons are disabled. One caveat though is that this is a bug in SwiftUI and iOS 26. The buttons are disabled, but the visual effects are still there, as if they're not. Now let's run this in a simulator and make sure that your keyboard is toggled when you enter the text editor. And now you see that you have a problem. It covers up our bottom toolbar. Well, that's no problem though. We can go back to our view and change the toolbar placement from bottom bar to keyboard. So let's run again. Now, if your keyboard's not present when you enter the text editor, you can make sure that you can choose from the I/O menu to turn off the Connect Hardware keyboard option, and that's going to force the keyboard to appear. Now we can see that we get the toolbar displayed only when the keyboard is present, and we can do all of the formatting that we want. And we can also tap on the keyboard button to dismiss it. Well, now we can create a new formatting menu. And for that, I'm going to use a modal sheet where it's presented to a bound variable. And that's that more editing button. Since the menu is also going to contain the first 4 buttons, I want to refactor that code that we already have into its own view so I can reuse it. So I'm going to create a new folder called Keyboard Toolbar. Now I'm going to cut out those 4 buttons up to the spacer and keep them on my clipboard. And I'm going to create a new SwiftUI file in that keyboard toolbar folder, and I'm going to name it Format Style Buttons. And paste in those 4 buttons. Now this is going to present a number of errors because we're missing the text, the selection, and the font resolution context. So first, we'll create that environment variable for the font resolution key path, so I can just copy it from the rich text editor view and paste it in. Now the text and selections are going to have to be bindings to variables that are coming in from the parent view. So we'll create one for the text variable that's a binding to the attributed string, and one for selection that's a binding to an attributed text selection. So to fix the preview errors, I can use a constant empty attributed string for the binding to the text and a constant attributed text selection object for the selection. Now the preview doesn't look right because these buttons are being displayed in a vertical V stack, which is the default container. But if you go back to the rich text editor view and make sure that you change the toolbar item group placement to bottom bar, we'll be able to replace the cut buttons with an instance of the format style buttons view passing in a text and selection as bindings. Well, this looks pretty good, at least for now, as you will see. So we can remove the environment variable now from the rich text editor view as it's not used. But we will be using it again. So let's create the more formatting view. So I'm going to create a new SwiftUI file in the keyboard toolbar folder, and I'll name it more formatting view. So we'll need that font resolution context environment variable here. And we'll also be passing in the text and selection as bindings, so we'll need bindings to both of those. So I can just simply return to the format style buttons and copy them from there and paste them back in. And I can fix the preview in exactly the same way by using constants for the text and the selection. Well, I'm also going to create a color picker, so I'll need a state variable for that. And I'm going to assign it the primary color as the default. And I'm also going to set the frame to be a height of 200 to the preview, because that's what our presentation intent is going to be. So this is what I want to display. We need to recreate this. So I'm going to replace the text view with the V stack. I'm going to set the alignment to leading. Then inside here, I'm going to create another text view just using the string format and make it bold. Below there, I want to display different font choices. And I'm going to offer 4 fonts, so I'm going to use a horizontal scroll view for that. And I'm also going to add some padding to the V stack. So within the scroll view, I'm going to create an H stack, and I'm going to set the alignment to first text baseline. But I'm also going to set the spacing to 0, and this will become apparent shortly. So what I can do is create 5 buttons, and each will use a different string label and a different font style for that label. The first is going to be extra large, but I'm going to set the font to a title font. And I also want to apply some horizontal padding to a padding of 5. And this means I'm going to be able to place a background around that with a rounded corner. So we need the remaining 4 ones that are going to be exactly the same. One's going to be for large, one for medium, one for body, and one for footnote. And for large, I'm going to use a Title II font. For medium, Title III. For body, it will be body. And for footnote, we'll use footnote. So you can make different choices if you like, but this is what I'm going for. So now for the actions. These are similar to what we did with the style buttons. We'll need to use a transformAttributes method on the text and passing in the selection to get the container. And then I can set the container's font to the font that I want. So in the case of extra large, we're setting it to title. And then we'll repeat this for the other buttons and adjust the font accordingly. For the next row now, we're going to start with our format buttons, but we'll also add ones for text alignment and color. Now this may be too wide for some screens, so we'll need another horizontal scroll view. And within there, we'll create another H stack for our format button styles that will pass in the text and selection as bindings. Well, now I'm seeing a problem. Since we are not in a toolbar, the buttons are way too small and close together in that H stack. It's not what I want. And another problem is that these system images have different widths. So when we want to add a background upon selection, each background is going to look different. So to fix the size, I'm first going to apply a font with a system size of 22 to the H stack here. Don't use a dynamic font type here, because that's going to change the size of the buttons depending on the user setting. Since each of the buttons have a different width instead of using spacing, we can apply a frame size to each of the buttons in our Format Style button view. So I'm going to go back to the Format Styles button view and apply a frame with a fixed width and height of 40 to each of the buttons. As you see, if you go to the rich text editor, that this doesn't affect the toolbar. It still looks good. In the more formatting view now, we see the buttons are now evenly spaced and sized. So we'll need to add 4 more buttons, and we'll apply that same frame to each one. So 3 will be for text alignment and 1 will be for color. So for the 3 text alignment buttons, we'll create a button using a system image for the label. And for left alignment, the symbol is text.alignLeft. And as I said, we'll need that frame. So we're going to copy and paste this 2 more times and use align center and align right for the system images. For the color picker, we can use the label text color and bind the selection to that color variable. But I don't want that label displayed, so we're going to set label is hidden. And again, that frame. So now we'll need actions for these buttons and for the color picker. Well, the actions for the style buttons are already done. For the text alignment buttons, we'll need again to use that transformAttributes method on the text with the selection argument to get the container. And then we can simply set the text alignment of the container to either left, center, or right. So in the first case, it's left. For the color picker, we can use an onChange modifier that will watch for changes to the color and then use the transformAttributes method again to set the container foreground color to that color. And the last button in the V stack is to remove the formatting button. So let's style it to be bordered. And for this action, we can use a transformAttribute methods again on the text and set the container back to an empty attribute container. And then to the entire V stack, I'll set the button style as plain. The last thing we need to do now is to present the more formatting view when the button is tapped. So back in the rich text editor view, we toggle the more editing variable so we can use this to present the sheet. And what we are going to be presenting is the more formatting view, passing in the text and selection as bindings. And then we'll specify a presentation intent that is just one, and that's going to be a height of 200. So we can test this out in the preview by making sure that the toolbar group is set back to bottom bar. If you want to test in the simulator or on the device, make sure that the group is set to keyboard. So now in our preview, we can enter some text and use the 4 style buttons if we want. But we can also present the more formatting view now by tapping on that button. And those 4 buttons work exactly the same way. And we can set the text alignment now though. That looks like I have left and right together where center should be in the middle, and I'll fix that in a moment. With the text selected though, I can set a color, but I can also set the font size of the selected text. Great. Let me just go back and switch the center alignment to the middle between left and right. So the final thing we need to do now is to have some visible indication on our buttons that we have actually tapped on one of the buttons to apply the style. And this is fairly complicated. So what I've done is provided you with a selection style helper file that you can use. And it's part of the helpers folder in the starter project. If you want to understand how these functions work, I really recommend that you let Xcode and its AI features of Xcode to help you understand it. You could open that selection style helper file, and then you can open the coding assistant in Xcode by using Command 0 or by going to the View menu and in the Navigator selection choose Show Coding Assistant. And what you can do is you can actually type, explain to me what the selection state functions do. And when you press Enter, the coding assistant will go through the code and explain it to you. And you can read through the explanation and you'll find that it is surprisingly helpful. But briefly though, you'll notice that there is a selection style state function that returns a closure. And the arguments for the closure are is bold and italics as booleans. So if you've added more of those types of styles, like small caps or whatever, you'll have to adjust your app buttons. You'll need to add them here. Well, the closure returns a tuple of named toggle state values. And those toggle state values are either on or off. They're enum cases. And that's one for each of the 12 different attributes that we've already added to our view. And I've given them all descriptive names. Again, if you've added more, you'll need to add them here too. And then for each of those 12 attributes, you'll see that I have a mapping function that gets an array of Boolean values so that you can see here how easy it would be to add more based on that pattern that you already have here. And then what the collapse value does is determine if the toggle state is on or off for all of the values in that array of selected text. So if we can get an array of all of the different cases, or all the states for the selection style states, then we can use that array to set the background color and style of one of the selected buttons. So to make this easier, I'm going to create a view modifier. So in the helpers folder, create a new Swift file and call it selected background _ view modifier. Import SwiftUI, and then create a struct called selected background that conforms to the view modifier protocol. And this is going to require a body function that will accept the content argument and return some view. And this is going to give us content to work with. So we're going to be passing in a state property that is a Boolean, either true or false, for the current evaluation of the style state. Since we want to use a different background style for the font as opposed to the button styles, I'm going to also pass in an isButton property that is a Boolean. So if the state is true, then we can apply the background color. Otherwise, we're just going to return the content. So if isButton is true, then we can apply a foreground style of white to our content, and then apply a background of the tint color in a circle. However, if it's not a button, it's going to be a text view, so we're going to use the same foreground style of white, but for the background, it's going to be that same tint, but in a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 8. And then to make this easier to apply, we'll create an extension on View and create a function called selectedBackground with two parameters, a Boolean state and a Boolean isButton parameter. But I'm going to default the isButton parameter to true, and it's going to return some view. And then we can use the viewModifiers method to apply the selectedBackground modifier, passing in the state and isButton parameters as arguments. So we're down to the final step, and that's applying the viewModifiers. So first we'll need to open the Format Selected Button view and make a copy of the selected variable, and I'm going to call it cell copy. So we can use that as an in-out parameter. So we can find all of the states of the selection by calling the selection state selected style states method, passing in the text of the cell copy. Resolve states is the closure. And we can tap on it to give us a font state that we can use. So we can create a resolve state variable, which is the font, calling the resolve method on that font in that font resolution context. The tuple return then is the resolve for isBold and isItalic states. With this then, we can use our new view modifier on each of our buttons. So for bold here, it's going to be the selected background modifier, passing in the state that is determined by our new selection state is selected for our state's bold property. And you can do the same thing for the other buttons using the appropriate state. And we can apply that same modifier to all of the buttons in the More Formatting view as well. First though, we'll need that same cell copy and states variable from our Format Styles view. So let me start on the second scroll view that contains the alignment buttons. These will use the same function that we used for the other buttons, so let me just get one. And all we have to do is change the state that we're checking for that button. Well, it looks like I have an extra frame here. Let me cut that out. And I'll apply that last modifier. I see. This frame should be here. Now I can go back up to the first scroll view for the fonts, but since this is a font, we'll need to add another argument, which is an isButton false to our view modifier. And then we can just check for each of the font size states as needed. So make sure your toolbar is set to the keyboard instead of the bottom bar. And I'm going to test in the simulator. Let me first enter some text. And when I do that, the keyboard appears and I can see my toolbars across the top. And when I select some of those buttons, I see that the background appears when they're selected. And then if I open the more formatting view, I see that the background buttons carried through here as well. And I can toggle them here. I can align the text. And I can choose a font color. I can also adjust the size. One last thing to test. When I tap Return, the font styles are maintained. And I want to remove them to start a new paragraph. I can open the More Formatting menu and tap on that Remove Formatting button. And when I enter text, I'm back to plain text. Well, that's a long video, but we now have a fully functional rich text editor with all of the components that I need to add to my own projects. Now, if you're interested in persisting attributed strings to a Swift data persistent store, then come back for the next video, where I use this same project and this view to create a nice little rich text note-taking application. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe to my channel. It really helps. And remember, you can get access to my videos by downloading my free channel listing app for the Mac, or you can use the web version on an iPhone or an iPad to get better searching and viewing of my content. Links are in the description.